What do you do with the years that seem to have disappeared? The years you gave to the wrong people, the wrong prayers, the wrong doors, the wrong hopes, the years that did not become what you thought they would become. Many people carry this question in silence. They go on with their work, their duties, their little routines, but somewhere deep inside they are grieving time itself. This reflection grows from an original source that is listed in the description. There is a particular sorrow that comes when life does not only wound your heart, but seems to waste your season. A heartbreak can hurt, a betrayal can cut, a disappointment can humble you. But when all of those things gather around your life and take years with them, the pain becomes heavier. It is no longer only about what happened. It becomes about what never happened. The love that never matured. The home that was never built. The peace that never fully arrived. The dream that kept asking for one more year until suddenly many years had gone by. And yet one honest way to understand suffering is this. What feels wasted to us is not always wasted in the hands of God. It may feel lost. It may feel buried. It may feel unreachable. But lost and unusable are not the same thing. A thing can leave your sight and still remain under divine care. A season can break your heart and still be doing a hidden work inside you. That is hard for the wounded soul to believe. Because the wounded soul counts visible outcomes. It says, I gave my loyalty and received betrayal. I gave my tenderness and was met with coldness. I gave my time and have little to show for it. But heaven often works beneath the level of immediate results. God is not only concerned with what you built outwardly, He is also attending to what was being built inwardly while you were loving, waiting, enduring, learning, surviving. So ask yourself gently, during those years I call wasted, what was being formed in me that I did not yet have the eyes to honor? Perhaps you learned how to recognize what peace is not. Perhaps you learned that your value cannot rest in who stays or who leaves. Perhaps you discovered the limits of people, and through that sorrow, the deeper steadiness of God. Perhaps the season stripped away illusions you would have clung to for another 20 years if life had not interrupted you. Pain is not pleasant. Pain is not holy simply because it hurts. But pain can become a teacher when it is laid honestly before God. Many people think redemption means getting back exactly what they lost. The same joy, the same opportunity, the same innocence. But life does not move like that. We do not go backward into untouched versions of ourselves. We go forward, carrying memory, wisdom, scar tissue, and a more serious understanding of what the soul needs to live. That is why divine restoration is so mysterious. It does not merely return you to an earlier chapter. It can gather the torn pages and make a stronger story than the one you first imagined. That does not mean you must pretend every loss was easy. No. Some losses deserve to be named. Some wasted years must be mourned before they can be redeemed. There is a dignity in saying, that hurt me, that delayed me, that cost me more than I knew. Spiritual maturity is not denial with religious language. It is truth spoken with enough courage that healing can finally enter the room. And healing often begins here, not with a miracle outside you, but with a change in the meaning of what you have lived through. What if the years did not only take from you? What if they also gave you eyes? What if the waiting taught you how much of your life had been built on fear of rejection? What if the closed door saved you from becoming a smaller version of yourself? What if the season that looked barren on the surface was quietly deepening your roots where no one could applaud you for it? A tree in winter can look abandoned to the untrained eye. Nothing green, nothing blooming, nothing impressive. But winter is not proof of death. Sometimes it is proof of preservation. Sometimes life goes underground to protect itself until the right hour returns. In the same way, there are seasons in the human spirit when nothing seems to flourish outwardly, yet something essential is being kept alive within. Faith may be quieter, hope may be dimmer, but the soul is still being held. You may not be able to recover every opportunity. You may not get back every relationship, every year, every version of yourself. But God is able to do something more subtle and, in many cases, more merciful. He can draw meaning out of the ashes. He can turn regret into wisdom. He can turn humiliation into compassion. He can turn a broken season into a life that now speaks gently to other broken people. That matters more than many of us realize, because some of the most trustworthy souls are not the ones who were never hurt. They are the ones who were hurt, did not let bitterness become their religion, and slowly allowed grace to do its quiet work. They learned how to become soft without becoming weak, clear without becoming cruel, honest without becoming hopeless. So breathe for a moment, not because everything is resolved, but because your life is not over where it was wounded. The years behind you are not the full measure of what remains possible. What looks like delay may still become preparation. What feels like emptiness may still become ground for new growth. And before we can speak about what restoration will look like, we must first understand this deeper truth. God does not waste the human soul that keeps turning back toward him, even through tears. And once the heart begins to accept that not everything painful was pointless, another truth slowly comes into view. Restoration is rarely a simple return. It is not life handing you back the same hour, the same innocence, the same doorway, and asking you to begin again as though nothing ever happened. It is more mysterious than that. It is more merciful than that. In the original source, this idea is carried through the image of God, not merely restoring what was lost, but transforming it into something fuller, wiser, and more fitted to who you have now become. That matters, because many people secretly spend years waiting at the door of yesterday. They say they want healing, but what they really want is reversal. They want the old version of love, the old version of certainty, the old version of themselves before grief, before betrayal, before shame, before disappointment educated their spirit in hard ways. But life does not usually offer reversal. It offers revelation. It shows you what you once called love was sometimes hunger. What you once called loyalty was sometimes fear of being left. What you once called peace was sometimes only familiarity. And when you see that clearly, you begin to understand why God does not always restore by returning old forms to your hands. He restores by maturing your soul until it can receive something truer. This is difficult for the human heart because familiarity can feel safer than freedom. Even pain can become familiar. Even disappointment can become a home. Some people do not actually fear suffering as much as they fear newness. Newness asks more of us. Newness asks us to become the person who can carry what we have been praying for. And sometimes that is a bigger miracle than the blessing itself. Think of how often people say, I just want things to be the way they were. It sounds innocent. It sounds understandable. But if we are honest, the way things were was not always whole. It was simply known, and the known can comfort us even when it is quietly diminishing us. So grace, in its strange wisdom, sometimes refuses to give us back what we miss in the form we miss it. It gives us something better shaped for truth. Not always easier, not always quicker, but deeper. A woman loses a relationship she thought would carry her into the future. For a long time, she thinks restoration means that person returning, changed at last, loving her properly, apologizing fully, finally becoming what she needed all along. But over time, something else begins to happen. Her discernment sharpens, her standards rise, her inner life becomes less dependent on being chosen by someone unstable. Her loneliness, while painful, teaches her to stop bargaining away her dignity for the sake of companionship. Then one day, what enters her life may not look like the old dream at all. It may not carry the same excitement, but it carries peace. It does not inflame her wounds. It honors them. That is restoration. A man loses years to confusion, delay, and fear. He blames himself for every missed opportunity. He cannot stop calculating the gap between where he is and where he thought he would be. He thinks restoration would mean getting all those years back on the clock. But perhaps restoration begins when his inner life stops being ruled by comparison. Perhaps it begins when he can finally work with a clear mind, love with a steadier heart, and move without constantly rehearsing his regret. That does not erase the past, but it redeems it. And that redemption may allow one faithful year to carry more fruit than 10 frantic ones. So let me ask quietly, are you grieving the loss itself, or are you grieving the self you imagined you would have been if the loss had never happened? That is not a cruel question. It is a freeing one. Because sometimes what we mourn most deeply is not only what left, but the future identity we built around it. We imagined who we would become in that marriage, in that job, in that city, in that season, in that role. And when it all fell apart, we did not only lose the thing, we lost the story we had attached to the thing. No wonder the pain feels so large. The soul is not only burying an event, it is burying an imagined self. But God is not limited to our first imagination of what our lives were supposed to be. If anything, one of the most tender acts of grace is that He continues to create meaning beyond the maps we drew when we knew less than we know now. He is not humiliated by your detour. He is not standing over your life saying, "This could have been better if you had done everything right." He already knows what the human heart is made of. He already knows how fragile we can be, how blind, how eager, how foolish, how sincere and confused at the same time. And still He calls us forward. This is why true restoration often feels less like getting your old life back and more like being introduced to a truer life than the one you were once trying to preserve. There is a quiet resurrection in that. Not dramatic, perhaps, not always visible to others, but real. It happens when your laughter returns without needing permission from the past. It happens when peace visits you in a room where you used to sit rehearsing every mistake. It happens when your prayer becomes less about give me back what I lost and more about make me faithful with what is still possible. It happens when envy loosens its grip because you begin to understand that your life does not have to resemble anyone else's timeline to be worthy and alive. And yet, this deeper restoration is not only inward, it has outward consequences. A healed self chooses differently. A wiser soul enters rooms with more clarity. A person who has suffered honestly and healed slowly often carries a steadier kind of authority, not the loud authority of performance, the quiet authority of someone who no longer needs to prove they are valuable. That kind of person does not chase every invitation. They do not force every door. They do not offer themselves where there is no honor. They begin to live from inner alignment rather than desperation. That shift alone can change a life. Because much of what we call wasted years was not merely time lost, it was time lived without enough inner freedom. We were moving, but not always from truth, achieving, but not always from wholeness, loving, but not always with discernment, trying, striving, proving, waiting for some future arrival to finally tell us we were enough, and then suffering, for all its sorrow, interrupted the illusion. It forced us to ask better questions. What is actually mine to carry? What kind of love leaves me more myself, not less? What is peace if it is not dependent on constant reassurance? What in me still needs to be healed so I do not keep repeating old grief in new clothing? These are not small questions. They are life-shaping ones. And often the person who asks them sincerely is already standing closer to restoration than they realize. So no, God's answer to your losses may not look like a simple exchange. It may not resemble the old form. It may not flatter your nostalgia. But if you let grace do its patient work, you may find that what comes next fits your healed soul better than what came before ever could. And slowly, humbly, with tears and gratitude mixed together, you may begin to see that restoration is not heaven pretending the damage never happened. It is heaven bringing life through what looked like an ending. And once that truth begins to settle into you, another struggle appears, just as human and just as holy. How do you live with a past that still accuses you, even while grace is trying to lead you forward? One of the hardest truths to accept is that God may be ready to move your life forward before your emotions have finished arguing with your past. The soul does not always heal at the same speed that grace arrives. Sometimes mercy opens a door, while shame is still sitting in the hallway, whispering that you have no right to walk through it. Sometimes a new beginning appears while old regret is still trying to convince you that you are disqualified from anything beautiful. That inner conflict can be exhausting. A person can be forgiven and still feel unworthy. They can be loved and still brace for rejection. They can be offered a new chance and still keep glancing backward, as if some former version of themselves has legal authority over who they are allowed to become. This is why the restoration of a life is never only external. It is also a restoration of identity. In the original source, this movement is clear. The past does not hold the deed to your destiny, and God does not define you by your lowest chapter. That is not sentimental language. It is a radical reordering of how a human being learns to see themselves. Because many people are not destroyed by one great failure. They are slowly diminished by the meaning they attach to it. They say, I made that mistake, Therefore, I am a mistake. I lost my way. Therefore, I cannot be trusted. I hurt someone. Therefore, I must spend the rest of my life carrying punishment in my spirit. I wasted years. Therefore, I no longer deserve joy. But guilt and identity are not the same thing. Regret can be honest without becoming your name. Sorrow can teach you without becoming your master. This is one of the deeper dignities of grace. It tells the truth without chaining you to the worst thing you have done. Some of us were taught to believe that shame is what keeps us moral, that if we stop accusing ourselves, we will stop growing. But shame rarely makes people holy. More often, it makes them hide. It makes them lie. It makes them perform goodness while secretly believing they are beyond repair. Grace works differently. Grace does not excuse what must be faced. It simply refuses to let the wound become the whole story. It says, yes, that happened. Yes, it mattered. Yes, there may be consequences, apologies, grief, repair. But no, your life is not over there. A person can spend years trying to atone for what only surrender can transform. That is why spiritual healing often begins not when you finally explain yourself perfectly, but when you finally stop negotiating with the false idea that you must become flawless before God will use your life. Perfection is not the entrance fee for purpose. If it were, none of us would step through the door. What God asks for, again and again, is honesty. Not polished words, not impressive strength. Honesty, the kind that says, I was afraid, I was proud, I was lonely, I was hungry for approval, I chose badly. I ran when I should have stayed. I stayed when I should have left. I did not know how to love well. I did not know how to trust. I did not know how to be at peace. And now I am here with the broken pieces, asking what can still be made. That prayer is holier than many performances. Look back for a moment, not to shame yourself, but to recognize what you survived. The nights when you did not know how you would get through. The seasons when you felt spiritually numb. The choices you made from fear and the grief that followed them. The ways you disappointed others. The ways you disappointed yourself. And still, here you are, still breathing, still seeking, still capable of tenderness, still capable of truth, still capable of beginning again. That matters. It means something. It means the story is not finished where you once thought it ended. Let me ask you something quietly. Who taught you that your worst moment had the authority to define your whole life? Was it religion without mercy? Family without gentleness? A culture obsessed with winning? Your own inner critic growing louder over the years? Wherever that voice came from, it was never the full truth. Because the voice of God does not erase responsibility, but neither does it imprison you inside yesterday. It calls you by a deeper name than your regret. And what is that deeper name? Beloved. Still becoming, still reachable, still capable of bearing light. That may sound too tender to those who think transformation only comes through harshness. But most human beings do not change because they are hated into holiness. They change because truth and mercy meet in the same room. They change because something in them finally feels safe enough to stop pretending. They change because grace gives them the courage to put down the exhausting labor of self-condemnation and begin the harder, cleaner work of actual growth. There is a difference between punishment and transformation. Punishment looks backward and asks how long you must hurt for what you have done. Transformation looks forward and asks what kind of person you are being invited to become now. The first can trap you in endless self-surveillance. The second can restore movement to your soul, and movement matters. Because regret, when left unattended, becomes a kind of false wisdom. It masquerades as humility, but it is often fear wearing a thoughtful face. It tells you not to try again, not to love again, not to hope again, not to answer the call on your life because you have already proven yourself unworthy. But that is not humility. Humility says, I am human, I have failed, I need grace, and I am willing to learn. Shame says, I have failed, therefore I must remain small forever. One opens the future, the other closes it. So if your past is pulling at your feet, do not drag it like a chain into every new season. Lay it down before God with as much honesty as you can bear. Learn what it came to teach. Repair what can be repaired. Grieve what must be grieved. But do not build your home inside the wreckage. Even broken ground can become holy ground when surrendered. Even cracked places can hold light. And when a soul begins to believe that, truly believe it, something softens, something unclenches. The need to constantly defend, explain, prove, and punish oneself begins to loosen. And in that loosening, another invitation becomes possible. Not just to be forgiven, but to trust. Not just to survive, but to stop striving long enough to let God work in the silence. There comes a point in nearly every hard season when effort begins to lose its power. You have prayed, analyzed, planned, adjusted, explained, endured, tried again, and still the answer has not arrived in the form you expected. At first, this feels like failure. It feels like abandonment. It feels like the terrible possibility that nothing is changing because you are not doing enough. But sometimes the holiest moment in a person's life is the moment they reach the edge of their own strength and discover that stillness is not defeat, it is trust. In the original source, this section turns toward the sacred discipline of being still, not as passivity, but as a deep form of faith. That kind of stillness is hard for many people because we live in a world that praises movement, noise, control, and visible productivity. We are taught to solve, to optimize, to chase, to make things happen. Even our spirituality can become another form of striving. We pray like negotiators. We wait like people checking the clock. We call it faith, but sometimes it is only anxiety dressed in religious language. We want certainty. We want evidence. We want to know that if we do the right thing in the right order, life will finally surrender its blessing. But God is not a machine, and healing is not a transaction. Sometimes what the soul needs most is not another strategy, but a deeper surrender. Not the surrender of hopelessness, not the surrender of giving up on life, the surrender of unclenching, the surrender of releasing the illusion that everything depends on your ability to hold the world together with tired hands. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes not only from pain, but from trying to carry what was never yours to carry. Many people know this exhaustion well. They carry other people's moods, other people's choices, other people's approval. They carry tomorrow before tomorrow arrives. They carry old conversations in their nervous system for years. They carry worst-case scenarios as if rehearsing disaster might prevent it. And all the while, the spirit grows weary, not because the person is weak, but because the burden was never meant to be held in that way. So what is stillness, really? It is not indifference. It is not laziness. It is not spiritual avoidance. Stillness is the inner act of saying, I will remain available to truth, but I will no longer let fear run my life. It is the refusal to keep thrashing in waters where panic has already stolen your strength. It is the quiet decision to stop treating anxiety as wisdom. It is choosing not to confuse urgency with obedience. That choice changes a person slowly and then all at once. A still soul begins to listen differently. It notices how many of its impulses are really reactions. It notices how often it moves to escape discomfort, not because movement is actually required. It notices how quickly the mind invents stories when God is asking for patience. Stillness reveals the interior noise we have mistaken for guidance. And at first, that can be uncomfortable. When you stop rushing, you hear yourself more clearly. You hear your fear, your resentment, your ache, your need for control, your grief. But that is not a failure of stillness, that is its mercy. What rises in the quiet is often what has been waiting to be healed. Ask yourself honestly, when I say I need an answer, do I mean I need guidance? Or do I mean I need relief from uncertainty? Those are not always the same thing. Sometimes we chase decisions because uncertainty feels unbearable. We want movement because movement distracts us from helplessness. But many of the deepest works of God happen in places where you cannot manufacture the outcome. You can prepare your heart. You can remain faithful. You can take the next honest step. But you cannot force fruit before its season. You cannot pull a door open by worrying it wider. You cannot turn fear into power simply by feeding it more thought. Stillness teaches you a better rhythm. It teaches you that waiting is not empty when it is inhabited by trust. It teaches you that a closed hand cannot receive, but an open one can. It teaches you that peace is not the absence of unanswered questions, but the presence of a steadier center from which to live while questions remain. Many people imagine peace as a reward they will receive after life is finally resolved. But peace often begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment you stop demanding that certainty arrive before you allow yourself to breathe. And perhaps that is why stillness feels so sacred. It returns a person to proportion. It reminds you that you are not the savior of your own life. You are not required to be all-knowing. You are not called to carry the entire future in your chest. You are a human being, beloved, limited, growing, sometimes tired, sometimes brave, often both at once. There is freedom in remembering that God remains God even when you do not know what comes next. This does not mean you stop participating in your life. You still make choices. You still apologize where needed. You still take responsibility. You still do the work that is yours to do. But you stop living in the fever of self-rescue. You stop forcing meaning from every delay. You stop imagining that the volume of your worry is proof of your seriousness. You begin to trust that divine movement can happen in silence, beneath the surface, beyond what your immediate senses can confirm. A person who learns this kind of stillness becomes harder for fear to dominate, not because they never struggle, but because they stop bowing to every internal alarm. They begin to understand that panic is loud, but not always true. They learn to pause before reacting, to pray before assuming, to rest before collapsing, to let a moment breathe before deciding what it means. This is a mature kind of faith. Not dramatic, not performative, but deeply rooted. And rooted people begin to recover their strength. Not all at once, often like breath returning after a long sob, like light rising slowly into a room that has been dim for months, like warmth creeping back into hands that forgot what ease felt like. You may still be waiting. You may still not know how everything will unfold. But if your spirit begins to rest in God, something important has already changed. You are no longer being ruled entirely by what you fear. You are making space for grace to move without your constant interference. That kind of rest is not the end of the journey. It is the ground beneath the next part of it. Because once a soul has learned how to be still, it becomes capable of something else that restoration always asks of us. Not merely to receive healing, but to rise differently because of it. And after stillness has done its quiet work, after fear has loosened its grip just enough for peace to enter, another calling begins to rise. It is not enough to be comforted and then return unchanged to the very posture that helped wound you. Restoration asks for embodiment. It asks you to live in a new way because something in you has, in fact, become new. The original source turns here toward a powerful truth. When God restores, you cannot walk back into the world with the same posture, the same smallness, the same agreement with voices that once kept you bound. This is where many people hesitate. They are willing to pray for healing, but they are not always ready to inhabit it. They want peace, but they still speak to themselves in the language of old shame. They want a new season, but they keep consulting the opinions that belong to the old one. They ask God for restoration while secretly remaining loyal to the habits that once kept them hidden. And that is deeply human. Sometimes the soul learns slowly. Sometimes freedom arrives before we know how to stand inside it. But one honest way to understand healing is this. It is not only something you feel, it is something you begin to practice. You practice it in the boundaries you now keep, in the way you stop over-explaining your worth, in the conversations you no longer allow to reduce you to your past, in the decisions you make from clarity rather than fear, in the quiet courage of not returning to what nearly drowned you simply because it is familiar. A restored life does not only receive grace, it begins to cooperate with grace. That cooperation can look very ordinary at first. A woman who once tolerated being chosen only in fragments now learns to leave the first time love asks her to betray herself. A man who spent years shrinking in rooms where he felt inferior begins to speak with calm honesty instead of rehearsed apology. A person who was used to chaos begins to protect peace, not as a luxury, but as a sacred responsibility. None of this may look dramatic from the outside, but inside, a whole spiritual architecture is changing. So ask yourself with tenderness, if healing were beginning to shape my daily life, what would I stop permitting? That question matters, Because some people wait for a heavenly sign while ignoring the earthly patterns that keep reopening the same wound. They call it patience when it is actually fear. They call it loyalty when it is actually self-abandonment. They call it humility when it is actually an old agreement with unworthiness. But restoration has a spine. It teaches you to stand, not harshly, not proudly, just truthfully. And truthfully means this: you do not owe your future to the habits that once kept you surviving. Survival deserves compassion, but survival is not meant to become your permanent identity. There may have been a time when people-pleasing protected you, a time when silence kept you safe, a time when lowering your expectations kept disappointment manageable, a time when staying small felt wiser than being seen. But if God is healing you, those old postures cannot remain untouched. They may have carried you through one season, but they cannot lead you well into the next. This is why restored people often feel unfamiliar to themselves for a while. They begin saying no where they once said yes out of fear. They begin resting where they once performed. They begin trusting the slow work of truth more than the quick approval of others. They become less available for confusion, less willing to participate in relationships that require them to betray their peace, less impressed by what looks powerful but feels spiritually empty. That shift can feel lonely at first, especially if your old identity was built around being needed, pleasing others, or never disrupting anyone else's comfort. But loneliness and misalignment are not the same thing. Sometimes you feel alone simply because you have stopped betraying yourself to stay familiar to others. There is a deeper dignity in recognizing that. And there is also responsibility in it. Because once you have been carried through grief, once you have been taught by sorrow, once grace has met you in rubble and slowly rebuilt your inner life, you are no longer called to live carelessly with what you have learned. Wisdom is not decoration. It is direction. The things suffering taught you must now become the way you walk. If disappointment taught you discernment, then honor it. If grief taught you tenderness, then carry it into how you treat others. If failure taught you humility, then let it soften your voice. If silence taught you how to hear God more clearly, then do not rush back into noise just because it is available. A restored person is not one who never remembers the past. It is one who no longer lets the past be the loudest voice in the room. And slowly, as you practice this new posture, your life begins to preach without your trying. Your peace says something. Your boundaries say something. Your refusal to return to spiritual confusion says something. Your gentleness, no longer mixed with self-erasure, says something. The fruit begins to speak, not loudly, not theatrically, but clearly. People may not understand what changed. Some may even resist it because your healing no longer allows them the same access to your fear. But let the fruit speak for itself. Let your steadiness answer what your explanations no longer need to. Because restoration is not only about being repaired, it is also about being repurposed. The dreams that once went silent may begin to stir again, not with the innocence of naivety, but with the steadiness of someone who now knows what matters. The vision you buried under disappointment may begin to rise, not as fantasy, but as responsibility. And when that happens, you will need courage again, a new kind of courage, not just the courage to survive pain, but the courage to live as though grace has truly visited your life. And that courage leads us into the next question, one that every restored soul must eventually face. How do you begin to live not merely as someone who endured, but as someone whose life now carries light for others? A healed life does not become meaningful only for itself. At some point, if healing keeps deepening, it begins to radiate, not as performance, not as superiority, not as someone pretending they have no more struggles. It radiates because suffering, when met honestly and surrendered deeply, can make a person more available to truth, more available to compassion, more available to becoming a place of rest for other weary people. In the original source, this movement appears in the call to live as evidence of mercy, to let your restored life become something others can see and draw courage from. This is one of the most beautiful things about redemption. It rarely stops with the individual. Grace travels. It moves through voices, gestures, choices, presence, and example. Someone who has truly been humbled by life and then steadied by God often carries a different kind of weight in the world. Their words are not louder, but they reach further. Their kindness is not decorative, but costly. Their peace is not fragile because it has already survived weather. They become the kind of person whose very existence says, despair is not the end of the story. That kind of witness matters more than many people know, because there are always others watching quietly. Someone who feels ashamed of their own detour. Someone who believes they have ruined too much to recover. Someone who cannot yet imagine life beyond their grief. Someone who has been disappointed by people, by religion, by themselves, and no longer knows what to trust. And when they encounter a soul who has suffered without turning bitter, who has changed without becoming cold, who has learned to speak truth without violence, something in them begins to hope again. Not because you solved all mysteries, not because your life looks perfect, but because your life has become believable. Believable hope is one of the rarest gifts a human being can offer. Many people offer advice before they offer presence. Many offer opinions before they offer understanding. But a person who has walked through deep valleys and returned with tenderness instead of contempt carries a kind of authority that cannot be manufactured. They do not need to impress anyone. Their scars already taught them what matters. They know how to sit with someone else's trembling without rushing to tidy it away. They know the difference between pain that needs an answer and pain that first needs a witness. They understand that healing is often uneven, that faith can be sincere and still exhausted, that a soul can love God and still feel confused. So let me ask you gently, what if the restoration of your life is not only about your relief, but also about your capacity to become refuge for someone else? That does not mean you must become everyone's rescuer. It does not mean you must turn your pain into a public ministry before it has fully ripened into wisdom. Some wounds need privacy while they heal. Some stories need time before they are told. But it does mean this: the comfort you receive is rarely meant to end at your own skin. Eventually, in some form, it becomes bread to be broken, light to be shared, language to help another person remain standing. Sometimes that happens in very ordinary ways. A mother who learned patience in her own sorrow stops speaking to her child with the sharpness she once inherited. A man who once felt invisible begins to notice the lonely people others overlook. A friend who survived betrayal becomes more careful with another person's trust. A woman who spent years doubting her worth now refuses to let the young people around her confuse attention with love. A soul who learned to be still before God begins to carry calm into rooms ruled by panic. This is how grace multiplies. Quietly, faithfully, through changed presence. And that changed presence is part of what it means to walk in restored identity. You are no longer only the one who was hurt. You are also the one who knows something now. Not everything, but something precious. You know that shame lies. You know that delay is not always denial. You know that tenderness can survive hardship. You know that peace is deeper than circumstances. You know that a person can lose much and still not be abandoned by God. You know that the soul can begin again after seasons that once looked final. These are not small things to know. They are lamps. And once a lamp is lit, it is not meant to be hidden under the old language of defeat. This is why restored people must be careful not to keep speaking about themselves only in the vocabulary of their former wounds. Humility is good. Honesty is good. But constantly reducing yourself to your brokenness can become another way of refusing your calling. There comes a time when you must let new language enter your mouth, not arrogant language, not self-inflating language, true language, language that says, I have been held, language that says, I am still becoming, language that says, what happened to me matters, but it is not the whole of me, language that says, God has carried me farther than fear said I could go. That kind of speech is not denial. It is alignment. An aligned speech changes what kind of future a person can inhabit. There is also something tender in remembering that your survival may be the answer to prayers you did not even hear being prayed. Somewhere behind your life, there may have been a mother's tears, a grandmother's faith, a friend's late-night hope, a stranger's quiet intercession, a younger version of yourself begging heaven not to let the story end here. The original source begins to move in this direction too, suggesting that the life you are standing in now may already be part of a long-answered mercy. That thought can humble a person in the best way. It can remind you that your life is not random, that your continued becoming is not accidental, that grace has been meeting you long before you learned how to name it. And once you begin to see your life that way, you do not walk with the same carelessness. You begin to treat your days as meaningful, your words as seeds, your peace as stewardship, your growth as responsibility. Not pressure, responsibility. The kind that says, I have come too far with God to return to living half awake. This does not mean every day will feel radiant. Some mornings will still be heavy. Some old voices may still try to revisit you. Some grief may still ache in places healing has not fully completed. But even then, you can live as one who carries light. Not because you feel strong at every moment, but because you now know where strength truly comes from. And once that becomes real in you, the soul begins to prepare for a final and beautiful shift. Not merely to hope that restoration is possible, but to live each day with a steadier confidence that your life, even now, is being gathered into meaning, dignity, and purpose. There is one more truth that can steady a person when old fear tries to return, and it is this. Your life may already be carrying the answer to prayers you never heard with your own ears. The closing movement of the original source turns toward this image of a restored soul walking in answered prayers, carried not only by personal strength, but by mercy that has been following them for longer than they knew. That thought changes the atmosphere of a life. It means you are not standing here by accident. You are not the leftover of failure. You are not merely the sum of bad timing, wrong choices, closed doors, and painful lessons. Somewhere behind your breathing, behind your survival, behind the fact that you are still trying to tell the truth about your life, there may be love that has carried you farther than you can measure. Perhaps a mother once prayed through tears that you would make it. Perhaps a grandmother asked God to keep you when she knew she could not protect you forever. Perhaps a friend, a stranger, a younger version of yourself whispered a desperate hope into the dark. And perhaps grace has been answering in ways too quiet to notice until now. Many people do not recognize mercy while it is still in motion. They notice it only in hindsight. They look back and realize that what they called coincidence was often protection. What they called delay was sometimes preservation. What they called the end was sometimes redirection. What they called wasted years were years in which their soul was being carried, corrected, restrained, softened, deepened, and prepared. Not perfectly, not painlessly. One of the most humbling forms of spiritual maturity is to realize that God was often working for you even when you did not yet know how to cooperate with that work. So if the voice of yesterday tries to creep back in, if regret begins again to talk as though it owns your future, answer it with gentleness and clarity. Do not answer with arrogance. Do not answer with performance. Answer with remembrance. Remind yourself that you are still here. Remind yourself that healing has already begun in places that once felt unreachable. Remind yourself that your life has not been abandoned to randomness. Remind yourself that even now you may be living inside the early unfolding of prayers once planted in love. That kind of remembering can make a person stand differently, not taller because they are better than others, taller because they no longer need to bow to despair. There is a sacred humility in that posture. It says, I have not carried myself this far alone. I have been helped. I have been held. I have been corrected by sorrow, comforted by grace, and guided in ways I did not always understand. And because of that, I do not need to live small anymore. I do not need to keep introducing myself to life through my wounds. I can live as someone who has been met by God in the middle of what tried to undo me. What would change if you truly believe that? Would you speak to yourself more gently? Would you stop postponing the life that still wants to grow through you? Would you release the exhausting need to compare your timeline with everyone around you? Would you begin to treat your days as holy again, not because they are easy, but because they are still yours to fill with truth, work, love, prayer, rest, and courage? These are not decorative questions. They are the doorway to a different way of living. A restored life is not a flawless life. It is a life that has learned how to belong to grace more honestly. It is a life that no longer worships what was lost. It is a life that can bless what it has learned without pretending the pain was pleasant. It is a life that can look at the past and say, you marked me, but you did not own me. It is a life that can wait without collapsing, hope without fantasy, remember without drowning, and love without abandoning itself. And perhaps that is the deepest restoration of all. Not merely that something returns, but that you return. You return to your own soul with more truth. You return to your days with more reverence. You return to God with less performance and more surrender. You return to your future with steadier eyes. You return to the mirror and no longer see only the person who suffered, but also the person who survived, learned, softened, and is still becoming. So let this settle gently on your spirit. The years were real. The losses were real. The confusion was real. The waiting was real. But they are not the only real things. Grace is real too. Mercy is real. Renewal is real. Quiet strength is real. The slow rebuilding of identity is real. The return of peace is real. The possibility of living with dignity after disappointment is real. And if you do not yet feel all of that fully, do not condemn yourself. Sometimes the soul learns slowly. Sometimes hope returns in small measures. Sometimes faith comes back as a whisper before it becomes a song. Let that be enough for today. Take the next honest step. Protect your peace. Speak truth over your own life. Rest when you need to. Refuse the old agreement with shame. Let your story ripen into wisdom. Let your presence become kinder. Let your future be shaped less by fear and more by the quiet conviction that God is still writing. And when you cannot see very far, remember this one thing. You are not late to your own becoming. You are not disqualified by your detours. You are not forgotten in the places where life hurt you most. You are still held, still called, still capable of bearing light. May that truth rest on your shoulders like a steady hand. May it help you breathe more deeply, walk more honestly, and meet the days ahead with a softer heart and a stronger spirit. And if this message found you in a season of rebuilding, may you carry with you this quiet assurance. Not everything was lost. Not everything was wasted. Something holy has been at work in you all along.